Okay.
So, Peter, welcome. A pleasure to be talking rather than typing. We've had a lot of conversations on Facebook, but not
Yeah.
until now in the flesh or
Yeah.
through the digital means.
Yeah. Good to meet you. And I'm looking forward to the conversation. As you say, we've typed to each other over Facebook, and I realize there are lots of overlapping themes that would be good to talk about. Yeah. I'm quite keen. I think I said to you, I had a similar area of conversation with Jay Brown.
Hmm.
I came away not feeling quite satisfied that I didn't think I'd done a good enough job in trying to bridge our differences. And I hadn't heard it back yet, so I don't really know how well or badly I came across there. But yeah, I am like you. I'm interested not in polarizing these debates, but trying to find some common thread. Where do our ideas overlap, and where is the languaging just that? And that we're talking about similar things as using different language. I think it's good to clarify that.
Well, let's sort of set the stage, so to
Yeah.
speak. That conversation, from what I could gather, was really exploring whether there was something we could call God or something more than this world. And from what I've read of your work, and should hold up your book just to give people some context, Intelligent Yoga, which is quite an arresting title, and quite intriguing at the same time, because it asks us to think. What you seem to be doing in your work is encouraging people not only to think for themselves, but to feel and to start from experience rather than from ideas. And obviously the whole tradition of yoga is full of ideas, and part of what I do is talk about the ideas that have influenced yoga. So I suppose there's a gulf a little bit there between where we're standing, and at the same time I sense quite a lot of common ground. So I'm interested in seeing how to relate ideas from old text to present world experience. And I saw in the first instance where I came across your writing at the back of Peter Connolly's Student's Guide to, I think, History and Philosophy of Yoga. You were explaining your approach a little bit, the inspiration of Vanda Scaravelli, and particularly the letting go of a lot of philosophy and just seeing what happened. And I'm curious what it was that led you to approach yoga in that way.
Well, Vanda was probably the bridge for me. I've explained I used to be an Iyengar teacher, which when I started it, which was back in the 80s, probably even late 70s, there was very little philosophy in his work in those days. It was all just exercise, really, stretching and getting into these shapes in the best way you possibly could. I think later my slightly more cynical view of what happened to him was he started to become more of a guru to respond to the demands of his students. When he first arrived in England, he was wearing shorts and a t-shirt and could have been a gym instructor, really. And then he
was actually encouraged to leave the philosophy out had he been wishing to put it in when he was training teachers for evening classes in London in the late 60s. So
I never heard him talk about. I mean, he got a little bit in his book, but it was mainly asana work and how to deal with the asanas and the benefits and what have you of them. And of course, if you study yoga, I trained through the Iyengar system and then did some work with the British Wheel of Yoga. So you come across all these yoga texts, the Bhagavad Gita and the Tantric texts, and Patanjali, of course, and all these ideas about what yoga is or isn't. And because you're a yoga teacher, you feel you've got to familiarize yourself with all these ideas and the chakras and the kundalini and some aspiration to try and get your chakras spinning and do the things that yogis should be doing. And of course, I started to feel a bit like a charlatan because that wasn't happening to me. I didn't feel my chakras. I felt stretch. I could feel those things. I could feel, my body moving around, but I had no sense of another inner world that wasn't my body. It wasn't that I couldn't put down to some kind of physiological explanation. And for many years, I just didn't talk about it. I just kept stum and, felt a little bit inadequate as a practitioner. But once I'd come into contact with Vanda's work, I got a bit braver, because she, in her book, Awakening the Spine, and her students, none of them, I mean, she pretty well dropped everything to do with Hindu philosophy. She even didn't really mention the names of the postures anymore. But she did start to insist on noticing how you notice gravity, how you notice your breath, and how you notice muscles release as you practice. They will have three kind of watchwords: gravity, breath, and release. And I found that deeply relieving, that I didn't have to think about all this other stuff anymore. I didn't have to worry about it. And so I started slowly shifting from my Iyengar practice towards a more Scaravelli-based approach. It took some time, and it was a difficult process because I'd invested a lot in Iyengar, but I did. I had a teacher called Mary Stewart in London, who you may or may not know of.
Read about through your book, but
yeah. She was a very prominent Iyengar teacher in the 70s, and I caught up with her in the 80s when she started working with Vanda, and her approach had changed to a more undoing approach. Now, if you've been doing Iyengar yoga and you've been sort of stretching to every cell of your body, and then some teacher comes along and says, no, do less, do less, do less. It's actually quite startling, because if you defined your practice through doing, and then someone says, well, actually, I want you to do less and less and less, you're not quite sure why you're there. What is the point of doing less? Because I only define myself by doing more. And that was the start of the journey, I suppose. When at some point the penny dropped, and I realized there was something in this idea of letting go. And I suppose my subsequent journey has just been the pursuit of that in spades. And seeing where it takes you, and it's taken me quite a long way. So,
would you not say, though, in some ways that is the essence of yoga philosophy, undoing and letting go?
Yeah, but that's I hear you, but it's not what I heard from my teachers. Certainly in the Iyengar world, there was nothing like that in the Iyengar world. So, you could talk the talk, but you didn't really walk the walk, and that for me ultimately was quite unsatisfactory. I think we should embody what we teach, and I think that's an important principle for me. I do take my yoga to heart. There's something about yoga that I found deeply useful for my physical and mental well-being, and it's related to the idea of letting go, both physically and psychologically, of ideas and beliefs and what have you, and just learning how you meet the world and what that interaction with the world does to you, means to you. Is it comfortable or uncomfortable? Was the discomfort something you can do something about or not? These kind of questions become more profound the more you plumb them, and I find that more interesting, to be honest, than trying to figure out what Patanjali meant.
Let's get down to it. What do you think Patanjali meant? I read an essay you wrote maybe 10 years ago or so about how he'd been sort of manipulated, and you analysed quite impressively the way that Iyengar had spun his point all over the place.
That was Peter Connolly's essay.
Okay, it was his.
Yeah, it's on my website, but it's Peter Connolly's essay. Yeah, well, I mean, he pointed out that one of the things Peter pointed out to me, was that, you can. And he wasn't, as far as I understand it, and you know these things far better than I do, he wasn't a Vedanta scholar, but, plenty of Vedanta scholars have studied his work and tried to Vedantarize his work and try and subsume his work into another picture. That's what that essay was about, the Vedantarization of Patanjali. And my understanding of Patanjali is that, his view is that our confusion, really, our problems, if you like, are based in our in a sense, belief that we are our stuff. We are this material world, and that, he's a dualist in the sense that he thinks our true nature resides in pure consciousness, or as my understanding, and not in the Purusha rather than Prakriti, if you like. And of course, I realize I don't believe that. So, a bit of a stumbling block if you bump into this and think, well, no, I don't think that that's my confusion. I think I am this stuff. I am this material body, and that's why I'm conscious. Rather than this body being some kind of pair of spectacles that consciousness uses to view the world.
I mean, that's the fundamental kind of, I guess, collision between the average Western worldview and the traditional yogic worldview, whether or not consciousness is sort of paramount, transcendent, eternal even, and whether it just is a phenomenon of the material existence of a body and a mind. Yeah,
exactly. And these are collisions. It's difficult to fudge them because they lead to a very different kind of practice if you think about it. If you think that you think of a lot of ancient yoga sort of ascetic practices where the body is almost disregarded, and you have these yogis sitting there with their arm in the air for 10 years because, in a sense, trying to prove how unimportant the body is compared to, the true nature of their being, which is consciousness. Now, I would never advise anyone to do that. In fact, I would advise people to take care of their bodies and, not in a puritanical way, but to take care of your body because that is what you are. And when we practice yoga, then part of our practice is how do we practice yoga in a way that cares for our body? It seems to me a very fundamental part of our practice, not one that bullies our body and beats it up and forces it into shapes that it's not really well adapted for. I would say what we're trying to do is reduce any conflict between, I was going to say mind and body then, but of course then I'm shooting myself in the foot because I don't believe that. Trying to find ease in life is about reducing conflict, not avoiding it, but reducing it where you can. And I think how we practice yoga is a part of that thing. Can I practice yoga in a way where I can do my postures and create ease in myself rather than stretch or strength or those kind of things if my goal is ease rather than anything more structural. I think we start to inquire, we start to notice more when discomfort arises and how we can deal with it. And then we can move on to noticing that we have similar aspects to our psychological and emotional world. We have discomforts that arise, and can we use them in a way without avoiding them? And I think this is a very rich way of noticing ourselves, starting off with a physical practice, and then of course it becomes a life practice. You're trying to take that view into everything you do and all your behaviors.
That's certainly a lot more exportable than where to put your big toe.
Well, yeah. I mean, ultimately, of course, that question came up, to me quite loudly, because in most of Iyengar yoga life, you're stretching your hamstrings as much as you can, and how does that change your life? And of course, it doesn't.
Well, no, I have had a recent experience of going to a consultant with arthritic hips, perhaps accelerated through too many trikonasana, and complaining also about my sciatica and not being able to bend forward like I used to. Yeah. He looked at me and says, "Well, what do you think those hyperelastic hamstrings are going to do for you then?" Yeah. Going to get enlightened. So yeah, it's difficult, I think, sometimes to rub up against some of the perhaps impractical nature of modern postural yoga, the way it's been systematized and rolled out.
It's a very nice way of putting the impractical nature of modern postural yoga, because even if you could argue just from an exercise point of view, that doing some exercise is quite good for us, but I think it's a lot more than that. I think yoga can be a lot more than that.
And I should certainly hope so. Otherwise, why call it yoga? It would just be exercise.
Precisely. In fact, I run these humanistic yoga courses, and my first session is always yoga is not exercise or performance. And the thing I kind of settle on, it's about discrimination of sensation and perception. So I'm interested in how we perceive sensation, what it means to us. So my cat is walking around in my lap, which is why my hands doing strange things. So and this maybe taps into the conversation I had with Jay. I'm a big fan of a neuropsychologist called Antonio Damasio. I reference him quite a lot in my books, and I follow his work quite carefully. And he took his interest is in how consciousness is constructed, over evolutionary time, and how self comes to mind, as in title of one of his books. He's a very serious neuroscientist. He's not on the fringe. He's pretty mainstream, and he's still, in a sense, either ahead of his field or running slightly adjacent to his field, depending on your perspective, I guess. But what I find very compelling about his arguments is the way he goes through it from an evolutionary perspective. He talks about, the first cellular creatures, very primitive creatures, the early kind of sensory nervous systems they have, and the muscular systems they develop, the brain structures that develop along with these sensory structures, and the commonalities they have with us. And he makes a very coherent picture about how evolution has driven an increasingly complex set of inputs to an organism, representing it to itself, in a sense. He talks particularly about interoception as the sense coming from the insides of our bodies, really the existential ones, the ones that tell us we're going to die of thirst or hunger or whatever. It tells us when we're tired. He says when we represent these feelings in images in our brain, we get a sense of self. So his idea that selfhood, self-identity, if you like, arises out of our ability to reflect on internal interoception. I quite like that. That seems quite satisfying to me,
And again, perhaps pulling in the opposite direction to traditional yogic descriptions of what the goal is. I mean, yoga was originally a state rather than a practice. There were many things one could do to get into this state of clarity, and the nature of the state, first described in the Katha Upanishad as the senses firmly reined in. So the idea of actually kind of completely disengaging from any objective content and instead turning attention somewhere else, and that would reveal
Yes, and
the truth.
A lot of meditation practice goes in that direction. But the more recent mindfulness sort of, I'm not sure where I sit with that, but the more recent sort of interest in mindfulness goes a little bit more into the embodying aspect, to pay attention to sensation as opposed to try to distance yourself from it. So I see a sort of a different direction of a contemplation there.
Could they perhaps, though, be two different manifestations of exactly the same project? Because
I think this is a good question to carry on. Say what you're going to say.
When we get in Patanjali this description of the steady, comfortable posture that everybody likes to quote, that is actually connected to the following sutra, which explains that you attain the steadiness and ease by relaxing effort, by undoing, as you describe it, also by absorbing oneself in the infinite, which is a bit more complicated. But the result of that is to not be troubled by painful sensations. Those are the three sutras on asana. And then if we look at, the very crude version of the ascetic, like that's the fast track to disengagement from the agony of like, please put your arm down. So that's the very crude approach, and we could see it as, you know, perhaps trying to sort of turn away from the world, but at the same time it's actually feeling the sensations intensely and not being troubled by them. The modern mindfulness approach arose out of, you know, chronic pain treatment and saying, well, this sensation is there. The more you identify with it and tune into it as problem that needs to be removed, the more it's going to kind of trouble you. Whereas the more you can face it with a kind of sense of allowing it to be and seeing that you're a field of awareness that isn't just that thing, then you can pay attention to painful sensation in the same way and not need it to go away either. It's almost like a subtler approach to the same project.
Yes, it has different meaning, you know, and I think that's the interesting thing. The other person I think is very interesting at the moment is Lisa Feldman Barrett.
Yeah, don't know that name.
Well, she wrote a book called How Emotions Are Made. So she and Damasio both have studied very thoroughly the way we construct ideas around feelings, emotions, moods. And I think this is very rich territory for people who are practicing an embodied practice, you know. And both of them talk about somatic markers, you know, the idea, Feldman Barrett particularly will say that the body states we feel, you know, maybe our heartbeat, tensions in our muscles, our respiratory state, the consequences of adrenal secretions, what they do to our airways and what have you, give us a particular feeling to which through history we have attached labels, you know, like anxiety or maybe not anxiety, maybe excitement, you know, with very similar somatic markers. You know, we could have the same physical feelings, but give them different labels. And she's done a lot of intercultural work looking at how different cultures talk about things like fear or anger, and they're often quite diverse. You know, she talks about, I think it's in Sri Lanka, an area of people who, when they're very frightened, their response isn't to, you know, open their eyes wide and, you know, make all the classic Darwinian responses of fear, that they fall asleep. You know, that's their cultural response to, you know, worry and anxiety. It isn't, so it's not that we all have the same. This is what she takes on in her book, How Emotions Are Made. She takes on this idea that all emotions are cross-cultural, they're all represented in the same way, we all have the same kind of facial expressions, which is very prevalent in literature. And she said, no, it just isn't so. So in the same way, she says there aren't brain regions that are specific for certain things. You know, they migrate, they can be in different places. They sometimes in the water, sometimes on, you know, the kind of modular brain. She takes on very harshly the triune brain. We have an old brain, a midbrain, and a new brain. Yeah. You know, all these myths that we tap into somewhere as part of our belief systems.
Belief system is an excellent phrase, I think, and part of, I guess, the distinction, again, if we're looking at things from, you know, this kind of more, I suppose, bottom-up, open-ended exploration process that you're describing, as opposed to the top-down. We've got the text; they tell us this is what we're supposed to experience. Can we make it happen? You know, one involves an obvious belief system. But what's the implicit belief system in the approach that you're taking?
Well, I mean, again, you're right. The implicit belief system is that emotions and feelings are constructed from the body. You know, that's pretty fundamental. There's reasonably, you know, if you take a reasonably science-based approach to that, it's quite verifiable in the sense that you can take parts of the brain away, or if you find people with parts of the brain missing and they've got some part of their sensory experience missing, you know, so you can correlate, and Damasio has done a great deal of work on that, you know, when he's had patients who have had brain damage through either accident or cancer or trauma, you know. There's been a deficit in consciousness of some sort. So I have some So the implicit belief system, I guess, there is that it's built through the complexity of neuronal interconnections, an emergent property of this connection. So, but I see this as the hanging on or attaching myself to a view that is the best explanation to my mind currently. And I do. The other thing I've been working on a lot in the last few years as part of my personal practice is to try to hold beliefs quite lightly, not to grasp them too tightly, because they change, and particularly if you're interested in something like neuroscience, it's changed enormously in the last 20 years. I mean, we know so much more than we did. 20 years ago, no one was studying consciousness. No one thought you could. And still a lot of people would say you can't,
No, exactly. It seems you can only approach certain manifestations of things and try to work backwards from there to a theory of consciousness.
Precisely. And, we're dealing with kind of qualia, aren't we, of the phenomena of me being a conscious person talking to you. I can't explain. It's like trying to explain the color red to a blind person. It's very difficult. There aren't words, as you said in your email to me. A lot is lost in translation. On the other hand, I think there's a great deal can be gained from having the conversation and trying to see what can we agree on, what can we sort of notice. And one of the things, in my yoga teaching, I try to find what I call as unambiguous ground as possible. And I use proprioception as that tool, if you like. I think most people, we can agree on a feeling of weight as you lean on a hand, or, a feeling of consolidation in a muscle as it starts to work, or a feeling of stretch as you move in them. I think these are common experiences that most of us don't have much trouble. We don't really debate that too deeply. Is that weight I'm feeling or not? But like you can, and I do this. I do say, well, are you pushing or are you leaning? I often say something like that. Can you distinguish the difference between, are you leaning into your hand or are you pushing through your hand? Is that something we can? So that kind of interrogation of proprioceptive experience, because we can change proprioceptive experience. That's about the only experience we can change at will. It is a way of helping us notice subtle differentiations of our feeling world.
So we can translate that into sort of simple terms. If we've got some control over the body and we can have an inner experience of what the body's doing, and paying attention to that very closely refines that awareness. And
yeah, that's right. Yeah, refines that awareness. And then, I think where you were starting to go with your talk about, the yogis or Patanjali talking about finding a comfortable place to sit. You can also do something else. You can make yourself comfortable, and you can become quite quiet. So I often end my classes doing nothing at all, and trying to ask people to take all the irritations away, make sure they're lying comfortably on the floor, that their mat and their jumpers and their trousers aren't wrinkled, and, so there's no aspect of their nervous system calling to them. And maybe focusing on something like the weight of your body on the floor, or the feeling of the breath in your body, something that, again, is unambiguous. After an hour or two of practicing yoga in a more finely calibrated way, people can become quite deeply quiet. And then what is that experience? How do we, and occasionally, and I would never say that this is a common occurrence in my practice or my classes. I'm not trying to get people to a state, but sometimes you do find yourself falling into a deeper place than usual. It might not even be when you're doing yoga. It could be when you're walking the dog, of course. And these kind of states, I think, is where we stumble into the spiritual, the mystical, or the prosaic, whatever we want to, how we want to label it. And I suppose I am interested why why we reach, because they're all experiences that we feel, we notice. I would argue, if I'm taking my materialistic view of the world, these are experiences conjured by the brain. In the same way, because I know these are very profound experiences. If you've ever, I'm sure you have, a few times in your life had those moments where you kind of collapse into something bigger than yourself, and all those times when you've been absolutely giddily in love, and it seems extraordinarily all-encompassing, or being crippled by grief, to a point where you feel completely subsumed by these emotions. So there are
go ahead, sorry.
Times when the experiences you have seem to transcend your normal everyday experiences.
Is there something that all of those different experiences that obviously have, very kind of different flavors, the way we've talked about them, grief and intensity of emotion in a different direction? Is there a common factor, though? Is there something sort of experientially similar, if they're all falling into this category?
I think my view is yes, but then, the two words that sometimes come up, and this is what I was exploring with Jane. I feel I probably somehow overemphasized the difference, because I wasn't quite sure how comfortable he was. It is oceanic feelings, or transcendent feelings, or sometimes called mystical feelings. These ones where we seem to go past the boundaries of ourselves. We dissolve into something bigger.
Past the boundaries of ourselves, I think. Yeah, it's a park that I would like to come back to that. Yeah.
Dropping the ego away might be a kind of yogic way of thinking. We go beyond ourself and become part of something bigger. Now, I'm really on side with that, as an experience. I have no problem with this. In fact, I see this as a kind of extension of a profound understanding of our systemic existence. I am not an individual. I only appear to be one. I am fully cogent of that. I am dependent on all kinds of things for my existence.
And ashes to ashes, dust to dust. In the end, I mean, we sort of spring together in this agglomeration of molecules and then disintegrate.
Yeah, and I couldn't exist without people and air and earth and water and the illusion.
Trees.
Yes, the illusion of independence is exactly that. It's an illusion. And the more profoundly you understand that, the more ecologically you'll live your life, because you understand that where you buy your clothes from, the food that you eat, the way you behave in the world doesn't stop with you. You're in a system. It's going to have an effect or effect on the rest of that system. And the way I behave with my fellow human beings is important to me, because I don't, I'm not an insularist in that sense. And I'm not talking about being introverted or extroverted. I'm just talking about appreciating the fact that life is systemic, not ego bound. And to me, that kind of oceanic feeling, that feeling of collapsing into the bigger, is like an exaggeration of that recognition, that we are just, I was going to say emote in God's eye, but that would be the wrong analogy to but a speck in the universe, which is going to carry on whether I'm here or not. But the other word is numinous, and if you look up the definition of that, it usually says something like coming into contact with something wholly other, something not of this world. So, and this is where I think people reach for God. And I suppose my question really is this the same feeling? Is the oceanic feeling or the numinous feeling really the same feeling? We're just reaching for different labels because we have different cultural backgrounds, and one likes to reach for that God word because maybe you have a more religious mind, and I'm happier with the oceanic because I have a more, I don't know, scientific mind, if you like.
Well, perhaps systematic would be another word rather than scientific, because it does seem that you're looking at the body in terms of this sort of integrated system that integrates into other systems, and things fit together, and so it's mechanistic in that sense of there's this causal connective interrelationship going on everywhere.
I'd be careful with the word mechanistic. I think.
I know you've said people aren't machines, but
well, it's true, and I think the word mechanistic doesn't quite capture systems as well enough, because an analogy I often use is a plant is in a system, and if a plant is unwell, it's something in the system. It hasn't got enough light, enough water, or the earth hasn't got enough. So you look at the system it's in to look for its health. With a machine, you don't really. It doesn't matter if it's cold or hot or dark, or like my car's going to start. It's.
I don't know. My computer defies logic when I try to fix it.
Yes, they're almost living things, aren't they? Right? Yeah, they're not so good an example, but mechanistic thinking often makes us think in a machine-like way. That we're looking at the parts more than we are looking at the system. So systems thinking. And I would pick you up a little bit on this, that I think systemic thinking is very scientific. Systems theory is quite a big branch of science. It's just not mechanistic science. It's not mechanics. It's systems theory. And living creatures live in systems, not in mechanisms, And I think often in yoga we've use mechanistic analogies, levers and pulleys, and to stretch and to see the body a bit like a machine, to get the parts working right, to get our core strengthened, or what have you. We look at the parts and think they have to work well.
You make that point very clearly in here, sort of the essence of what you're saying about your approach, that by getting biomechanically aware, we can actually get further from a sensitive and intelligent experience of embodiment.
Exactly. Yeah, it leads us in the wrong direction for health and well-being. And of course, once you start applying a systems theory to your body and realize it's a relationship between the parts of your body that's interesting and not the parts themselves, it's not a great leap of imagination to think that might be happening in your family, in your community, on your planet. It's the same kind of thing. How are people relating to each other is more important than the people themselves. What is their relationship? If you're in a relationship with a partner over a lifetime, if you spend your life blaming the other person for all the ills in your relationship, you're making the same mistake as blaming your psoas muscle for the pain in your hip. It's not the part that's the problem. It's how you engage with the part. How we have our conversations, how we have our relationships. This seems to me much more useful to us and much more appealing to me, anyway.
I hear you, and at the same time, I feel moved to sort of stir the pot again. To what extent are we trying to get comfortable? Is that really the aim of yoga? I mean, if we're going to come back to traditional texts and see something in them, perhaps to salvage, surely the point is actually to go beyond the comfort zone and to not try to reinforce the sort of needs of this voice in the head to have things the way we desire them. The whole aim of yoga philosophy is to go beyond the need for anything to be any particular way whatsoever. And that's what dissolves this idea of the self. That's what brings about more oceanic experiences. The more we need things to be a certain way, the less likely that is. I
think this is something I think people often misunderstand. When I'm talking about ease, I'm really saying don't make life more difficult for yourself than it needs to be. Life is full of difficulty. I'm not talking about avoiding difficulty. Which is why I still do some quite complicated postures. I still stand on my head from time to time, which surprises people. Not because I think there's any benefit in standing on your head, and I really don't. But I do think
3 hours a day, you'll become immortal, says the
there's always that, yeah. I'm really 150
Anyway, sorry,
years
go
old, you know.
on.
But you know, there is some interest for me to see how can you do difficult things and make them comfortable. In other words, what I'm more interested in isn't having an easy life in the sense that otherwise you just avoid doing anything difficult. But noticing, you know, when you need to use effort, when you need to use balance, when you need to find support to make something possible. If you're in a relationship, there'll be plenty of times when you'll run into differences and potential conflict. And I'm not talking about then walking away and not having the conflict. And how do you have a conflict in a way that you resolve both your needs without resorting to violence? It's or with the body, you know, how can we move into postures in ways that, you know, I don't know, you could do something like plank pose, which demands a certain amount of muscular activity, and particularly with some of the, you know, for most people who've done yoga, teachers who've done lots of yoga, it's not that problematic. But you know, I teach lots of elderly people who aren't strong, but I'm interested in helping them find ways to do these things and to get up and down off the floor and all those kind of things in a way where they use their body. They don't get frightened of their body because it's hurting all the time. They find ways of doing things with ease. That's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in trying to find ways of having conversations, difficult conversations with people, without resorting to ad hominem attacks and, you know, name calling. How can we have conversations? How can we be with people? How can we be with the planet? Still have some needs, man. I don't kind of agree that I want to be a needless person. You know, I want to eat, I want to sleep.
Well, that's obviously the problem. I mean, if you follow this stuff through to the logical conclusion, then you're either an ascetic who just walks around with a bowl and you'll eat if people donate and otherwise you'll starve. Or you do give up desire completely and actually renounce the body and the world and conscious existence because, you know, there's nothing else to do. So if we're living in the world, there's still a certain desire, but the yoga texts always spin it that the only legitimate desire is the desire for the self. That's the way the earliest Upanishad puts it. So as long as your only quest is to be liberated from all desire, then you've got no problem.
Whereas I think it's almost a harder job. Because in a way, that's black and white, isn't it? You're either doing it or you're not. You know? And black and white's often simpler, I think, than the more nuanced approach is, what do I really need? And what do I want? You know, what can I let go of that's not essential? And, you know, what is still useful and nourishing for me? And I think these are interesting questions. And I think this is the same in yoga. How much effort do I need to get into this posture? Can I do it with less effort? Can I arrive at the same place with less effort, less strain, less struggle, but still accomplish the same thing? And I think these are very interesting and useful questions because they, you know, you can apply them. They're very worldly in the sense that they help us navigate life. And I sometimes find these rather more dramatic statements from the yoga texts either dispiriting because there's no bloody way I'm ever going to be able to achieve that, or they seem to, they're magical thinking for me, you know.
Well, they're also reframed as the history of yoga develops into a much subtler experience. I mean, the Buddha is the one who sort of most obviously charted this middle way between self-indulgence and self-restraint. And, you know, there's similar ideas there in Vedanta and in Tantra. But the essence really is, as you're describing, to allow things to sort of be experienced without trying to hold on to them too much, or push them away, one or the other. The craving aversion dichotomy is there. So the suggestion from yoga philosophy is that those are the two most fundamental ways in which the mind gets rigid and needs things to be a particular way to be satisfied. And so we have to offset them somehow in order to stop that from happening.
I like that, you know, the way the mind gets rigid. I have a real interest in that too. You know, how do we, you know, because beliefs often ossify over time, don't they? That you find people can become more bigoted as the older they get, because their ideas are never challenged, or they never want to challenge their ideas. And bodies can get the same if you stay in the same place, or you never do any different movements. If your body gets stiff, I'm not trying to say here that because your body gets stiff, your mind gets stiff. That's a false sort of analogy.
It's Patabi Joys, I think.
Yeah, I think that's nonsense. You can have a very people like Stephen Hawking would be a very good example of someone whose mind stayed very flexible and open. His body was clearly unmoving. But if you one of the arguments I make about yoga is, and I'm borrowing from Peter here, Peter Connolly. If you think of yoga as a soteriology, as a way out of suffering, as a means out of suffering, and he would add, and I would, to a kind of humanist flavour of enhancing flourishing. We suffer both with our bodies and with our minds, of course. And so I see yoga as a very nice way of bridging those two domains. That we have a physical practice to make sure our body can continue to move into old age in ways that are comfortable for us, that we aren't stymied by our body. And also to try to, one of the questions I am starting to ask more is not what people believe anymore, but why do people believe what they believe? What are the origins of people's beliefs? I'm very interested in that. And I interrogate myself about that. Well, how did I come to believe this? Why am I of this persuasion? I had to the time when I really bumped into that in space was Brexit. Because I was a Remainer, and I got into a real heavy debate with a Leaver. And I realised I had no idea why I was a Remainer. Really, I hadn't studied the EU. I had nothing. I never really looked at the politics of it. And this person had. So I felt I was completely wrong-footed when he pointed out all the horrors of that were going on in that. But when I did reflect on it, I realised that I was a Remainer because my dad, who fought in the Second World War, spoke just in the background, never gave me a lecture, never talked about it, but in conversation, if he was listening to the radio, we joined the common market, he'd say things like, isn't it wonderful we're not fighting anymore? Isn't it wonderful that we're trading? Isn't it wonderful that we're friends with Germany now? This profoundly affected him, I think, and it just leaked into my consciousness as a child. And I just grew up, and my mum loved going to France, and we would go on holidays there. Or she, I'm now married to a Swiss woman, so there are all these ideas seeped into me from my childhood. It was never a cognitive decision. I never weighed the two up. I never thought, should we be in Europe or outside? Just that wasn't. It was a kind of, what do they call it? Implicit bias or something.
Well, the yoga language might be a samskara. So you've got you've got this groove kind of marked in the mind, and your thinking runs in accordance with that, and it's hard to slip out of those grooves. Yes,
and then you realise that probably your politics has been shaped that way, your political beliefs, somewhere, or you realise that when you went to university, they got shaped there by charismatic teachers who, taught you Marx or, Derrida or whoever, that you became influenced by, and, the fire got burning in your heart, or you became an Enlightenment, ideas person because someone landed those ideas with some weight at a time when you were open to it. So I'm very interested in trying to trace back both, because, when you look at somebody, this is how it first came up for me. I realized that when I'm looking at my students in my class, I'm looking at their history shaped in their bodies, their tensions, their worries, their anxieties, their histories are written into the way they've responded to the world, their fears, their eases, or whatever. You get a sense of the life they've had, by what's written into them. And then, of course, there's no way you're going to change that in a class or two, because it's been a lifetime of formation, as are people's beliefs and ideas. And you're not going to change those by having an argument with someone, because, that's what I realized in Brexit. You could give all the logical arguments you like, that they never signed off their accounts, that there was a lot of corruption, that we lost our, all those kind of things that the Remain believers. So didn't make any impression on my more visceral sense of being European. What would have made an impact on me if someone had started to talk to me about, how did you become European? Have you thought about it? Have you thought about Remainers, how they became Remainers, what their family history was like, what their stories were, why they grew up with this sense of sovereignty and nationhood and, independence and believing in the God, Queen and country or whatever, and why they feel so strongly about leaving. That would have made an impression on me. If someone had put those arguments out at the time, I'd have been more moved. And I realized that we have to somehow reach into people's lives a bit and take some time to consider how they might be seeing the world, before you take aim and have a pot shot. So, yeah. and that's where I felt I didn't quite get to with Jay, and I regret it. We didn't have any arguments or anything like that, but I think what I would have liked to have asked him, I would like to have reached into him a bit more and said, well, where did these more religious feelings come from? If you think back in your life, how did they first form in you? Did you have a parent or a guardian or a friend or a group of people who that made you feel comfortable and at ease? Then immediately I would begin, no, I get you, I hear you. And
well, how about we turn that round then? Let's go back to the oceanic and the numinous, and also to the coming back to this sort of yoga philosophical triad. Really, we dealt with two aspects of it: craving and aversion, and pushing some things away and hanging on to others. The idea is that's all rooted in ignorance, and that there is actually something that isn't the body and the mind that we experience. Now, very clearly, you've stated that that's not your perspective. You don't think there is anything beyond the body and the mind. Yeah. In which case,
phenomenal.
Well, there's the phenomenal world, all right, but in our experience of it, and there's a way of there is no way of perceiving that isn't actually the body and the mind.
Yeah.
And I remember the first encounter I had with sort of meditative philosophy, I suppose, was buying a book. When I was a student, I'd had a bad trip. I was very anxious, and I found myself in a Buddhist bookshop, and this title leapt out the shelf at me. It said, "Experience Beyond Thinking." And with my mind going around in panic attack all day long, I thought how wonderful it would be to have an experience that was not mediated through thought. Yeah. And I tried to sit down and meditate, found it impossible, and it took quite a long time before I actually understood what it meant to meditate. But is it possible, do you think, to have an experience beyond thinking? Because it sounded like that's what you're describing in this oceanic state.
Yeah, I do. I certainly think you can. Well,
is the mind actually just inactive?
No, I don't think it's ever inactive. But it depends what we're calling the mind. Again, we fall into these. If we talk about the brain, anyway.
Well, I suppose that's it. Yeah, maybe the brain is deeper and richer than we know. But it's arguably, and I think the leading arguments say that mind is a phenomena of the brain. I think I'd be surprised to find a tree has a mind. Doesn't mean to say I don't think trees have some kind of intelligence. In that they can respond to, you're probably aware of the rich chemical lives trees have with their environment through the roots and through their leaves. They're responding to the environment all the time to enable them to survive.
So there is some kind of intelligence to work, but it's probably not minded intelligence. But, you know, living creatures, mammals particularly, probably fish and lizards too, have something we could call mind that gives rise to experience. And, you know, does my dog have thoughts? It's certainly she has experiences. She dreams, she has emotions. I'm absolutely sure about that. There are times when I can sense sadness or anxiety in her. You know, she sees a bigger dog, or it's nearly supper time, a bit of excitement comes in. And that's very readable in an animal. You'd have to be, I think, very thick-skinned not to believe animals don't experience emotions and probably mood. You know, I think there are days where I sense my dog is happier than other days, you know. So these aren't words. This isn't thinking. This is body experience. And I think that it's possible. In fact, I would argue it's relatively simple. It is a big claim to do that. In fact, I often say in my classes, the thing that surprises me about immersing yourself in sensory experience, proprioceptively largely, is it stops me thinking within about 30 seconds, you know, to a minute. If I really immersing myself in feelings in my body, and unless my students are just trying to keep me happy, you know, quite a few students have fed that back to me that they feel the same. But feeling and thinking are almost mutually exclusive. To be immersed in, you know, it's a bit like if you're trying to thread a needle, something like that. You're doing some very detailed task where you're having to pay a lot of attention on your proprioceptive skills. You won't be thinking about the shopping or you know, your worries, because, or if you are, you won't be able to thread the needle.
No, I see what you're saying. Yeah, so it's really a question of abstraction and conceptualization in the mind, as opposed to, you know, absorption in felt, you know, presence with whatever's. You know,
absorption in the felt sense is a good way of quietening the ruminating mind. Yeah, I really think that's true. In fact, I really think that's true. It's fundamental to my teaching. I find it much easier than sitting meditation. Personally.
Well, exactly, and that's probably why there are a lot more people who go to a yoga asana class of whatever variety than there are signing up for silent meditation retreats.
I think you're right. Actually, I hadn't put those two together. I've always felt slightly on the defensive when I've said that, you know, out loud. I find meditation quite difficult, but I'm quite good at quieting my mind through yoga practice. But as you know, as you've just said, I think I'm in good company. A lot of people feel the same.
Well, absolutely. But then I guess I would have to turn that around and say, why the distinction between yoga and meditation, when for most of the history of yoga, meditation was the means to the state of yoga?
Well, you know, I would, if people ask me, do I meditate? I say, yeah, but it's my yoga practice. But I really don't. I've, you know, the other thing I take on here, if you take the view I'm taking of an, you know, I don't even like the word embodied because it implies you could be disembodied.
That would be death.
You know, living human being. Yoga has historically always seemed to separate out mind, breath, and body. You know, you have an asana practice for the body, a meditation practice for your mind, and a pranayama practice for your breathing, and that's always struck me as very reductionist, that all three of these things are integrated into a physical practice. You know, and my mind calms down, my breathing normalizes. If I slowly learn to let go of tensions and habits and the biases of my past, then these things become integrated.
To be fair, I think some of the earliest physical yoga texts, certainly the earliest that I know of that teaches the mudras of Hatha Yoga is very clear about the sort of integration of the various aspects of embodied experience, and says you can really either still your mind, you can get control over your breath, or the other sort of I guess bigger picture metaphor for embodied experience is to do with sexual fluids and mastery of the bindu. So if you get any of those under control, the others automatically follow. So you could say that that's sort of the strongest kind of desire after staying alive and keeping fed.
Maybe I'm looking more at the modern yoga practice that has kind of separated out these things. You buy books on pranayama and books on meditation.
Well, absolutely, yeah. And sometimes these days, I wonder how much of modern yoga practice should be called yoga. And I suppose that's where I want to reach back to your book just before we draw to a close, because you're making a very quite I would say clear and strongly worded, strongly argued, and quite convincing case for letting go of most of what's been, I guess, attached to yoga and starting again from first principles that you then go on to lay out. And you say, if we reframe yoga, however, and substitute metaphysical ideas with more concrete naturalistic ones, can we still call it yoga?
Yeah.
And you go on to say why you think we can, and we've been talking about that now. But I guess the question for me is, if yoga is actually a state and is really the outcome of whatever the practice is, what is the outcome of a humanistic approach that lets go of this philosophical baggage? What's the orientation even? What's the aim? Is it just to get more comfortable in this moment?
No. To go through your life in a way where you cause less disharmony and more cohesion, to find a way of, I think the Chinese would call it skillful living. You go about, you have your aims, you have your interests. I'm a yoga teacher, I'm an osteopath. I want to do a good job in both those fields. I'm a husband and a father. I want to do those jobs well. I'm part of a local community of people, that I want to participate with equitably and be a useful member of. I want to be generous where I can be. All those things that result in a rich life. When I'm on my deathbed, because I obviously only believe I've got one go at this, I want to look back and go, that was all right. And also, this is the other thing, just before we go, because I never quite got to this with Jay. One of the things that this really does for me is makes me meet death with much more equanimity. Because fundamentally, I just think, bloody hell, how lucky I've been on this so far for 68 years and being able to witness this rather magnificent universe that I'm living in. And, my joke is I could have been a rock circulating Pluto, but I'm not. I'm a sort of conscious series of atoms having a conversation with Daniels on the internet with all the rich experiences that I've had in my life. And I just see that as fantastic bit of luck.
Well, I guess then the question would be, is it just luck? I mean, we can be grateful for all of the causes and conditions that have come together to make that possible, but perhaps if we're teaching, can we chart the way? And a lot of what we've talked about, I think, articulates that. But if the aim is to live life skillfully, what's the means?
To notice, I'm just going to turn the light on.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah. That's better. The twilight was kicking in. Yeah.
The way I think about this is that you get better at noticing, either physically in your body or emotionally or psychologically, when discomfort arises. And then you reflect on that and ask yourself, what is that about? What is this discomfort about? So you may have had some crosswords with your partner or your children or your friends, and you go away and there's a little knot in your stomach, which isn't quite comfortable. And that's there to make you reflect. Discomfort, really, the role of discomfort in the body, of course, is to make you shift your position. If I'm sitting there and eventually I get a pain in my cheek, it's obviously saying, well, move your head. Or if I've been sitting on my feet for too long and they go numb, move your position. If you don't listen to discomfort in your body, if you don't notice it and adjust yourself, then you're going to stay with discomfort. If you have discomfort emotionally and you don't reflect on it and look at how your behavior might need to change, or it could be, of course, somebody else's behavior, you might need to have a conversation, then you'll maintain that discomfort. So the skill for me is to notice when you start to feel uncomfortable, reflect on that discomfort, or and get better at noticing the moment it happens, so you're closer to the thing that triggered the change in experience that you're having, and then say to yourself, well, what did I do then? Was that all right? And try and be as honest as you can with yourself. And of course that is hard, and sometimes you do have a conversation, but I try and take that seriously. Did I say something then? Yeah, I've got a couple of things on my mind at the moment. A couple of things I can sense a discomfort and I want to put them to bed. I've got an email I want to write to somebody soon because I feel I've upset them somewhere, and I want to reassure myself or confirm to myself what's actually happened there. Or if I don't do that and I just bury it, I suspect these things resurface. They come back and bite you later on. They don't disappear. A bit like sitting on your foot for too long. If you leave it, eventually the blood supply goes and you have real pain. So the method for me is to introspect feelings and notice the ones that make you feel uncomfortable, and then ask yourself why they arose and how can you navigate that now? What are you going to do about it? Rather than just say, I feel shit, and go on feeling shit tomorrow and the next day and the next day. Try and understand a little bit more about the fluctuations in your mood and what fluctuates them up and what fluctuates them down. I think this is a useful strategy.
I think you've identified through describing that another major contradiction between the way a lot of traditional yoga philosophy is presented and the instinctive Western worldview. But we've already acknowledged that there's a limit to how much control we have over things. Perhaps that is the only way in which we do have some control, is observing our felt experience and seeing what we have some agency to be able to influence in shifting the conditions. But many of the reasons why things are the way they are, including our beliefs, predetermined long before we got to thinking about that. So we can only work to a certain extent with that structure, whereas a lot of yoga philosophy is almost constructed around the idea that everything is sort of predetermined by previous actions. All we're doing is adding to the load in the moment. The aim is to undo everything to the point that there's nothing left at all, and that'll be liberation, and somehow we'll just sort of automatically be. Perhaps actually, again, there are two ways of describing something similar if you don't take it literally to the world-renouncing perspective.
I was
living lightly.
Yeah, I was wondering how differently those two views would act out in the world. I don't think that differently, to be honest.
I think you come sort of two ways round to a very similar place.
I think that's often the case. But it's good to have the conversations to find out. I think obviously when you get into more religious views, there may be a plan, a way you should live your life, and that's a little bit more top down. And I wrestle with that a bit more. But again, I've got some Christian friends who, when I talk to them very seriously, that the way they live their life isn't very different to the way I live my life. So, goodness sake, let's not fall out about that.
Fair enough. I mean, I used to go to parties and talk to Christians and try to sort of, I guess, interrogate them as to why they were Christians, because I wasn't one and I didn't really get it. And so I hear you and I understand where you're coming from. But I can't help but feel moved to conclude by observing that effectively you were talking about the two kind of guiding principles of honesty and I guess alleviating suffering through diminishing discomfort and paying attention to that clearly. Those are the two fundamental values of what gets called Sanatana Dharma in the ancient Indian text, which is the modern day synonym for Hinduism. So in effect, non-ahimsa and satya, they're your foundational principles. You are ergo a Hindu.
Glad you told me. Good to find out.
But at the same time, what are these labels? I suppose is what I really come down to at the end. Is
I think we all try and find. I've often reflected on this with different styles of teachers, that people find their way to you as a teacher, not because you're doing it the right way or the wrong way, but because your way resonates with them. So over time you collect some students around you who hear what you're saying in an easy way. It's not a battle for them. And that's good. And I'm glad there's a variety of teachers out there doing similar things, using different languages and different styles, and so that I don't have to wrestle with people who struggle with my way of teaching. They can find another. It's a good thing that. And that took me a while to get to. But when you start yoga teaching, I think you often spend a lot of your time trying to please all your students, and do a little bit of this for them and a little bit of that for the others, and you become a kind of jack of all trades. And then mention a little bit of Patanjali at the end, and do a little bit of pranayama, just so that you've covered all the bases and everyone's happy. But I'm quite happy if someone comes to my class, they email me and say, "Nah, not for me." That's great, because then they can go and find somebody else. And the people who like the way I teach, or the way you teach, or anybody else. Self-selecting audience, but it's towards the end of your teaching. I mean, if you've been teaching a long time, like I have, I think that's where you want to be. You kind of want to be there, not still trying to please your class.
Well, again, that would be just molding ourselves to a kind of conceptual, I guess, sense of what we should be doing, rather than actually tuning into what we can actually experience and talk about from experience. If we're not talking from a place of direct perception, that's got nothing to do with philosophically in ancient India what yogis claim to be up to. So
no.
They're not interested really in inference or scriptural authority in the same way. It's all about direct perception.
And you have to then argue, is that possible? Direct perception. That would be quite clever, wouldn't it?
Well, I don't know. I suppose that's what we've been talking about in a way. It's very difficult to find the right words for it, but there is a way, as we've been talking about, of perceiving without giving a running commentary on the experience. And
but it is inference. I think it is inference.
Well, what we're saying about it is inferred, but the oceanic moment is still.
I see. Yeah,
it just is.
They're rare, aren't they? I mean, I'm not expecting any of my students or myself to be living in an oceanic moment for my whole life.
Well, I think that's the great lie. Peter Connolly in that essay, he had a pretty provocative phrase for it. I think he called it the Brahmanical bullshit package. The way Patanjali gets dressed up in this story that helps to sort of sell everything in a Vedanta way, and I might quibble with that phrasing, but at the same time. I don't know. I think we can overcomplicate things, and a lot of gurus have, by trying to pretend that they were always in that state. If you are actually in that state, you're certainly not going to get into conversations about it. I think by very nature of duality of conversation, we're having a different kind of mediated perception than we would be having if we were just sort of in the moment. And it's not possible to live that. If nobody would want to. It's the same as having a lobotomy in a way. You need to have a functional mindset that's capable of getting the bills paid and putting food on the table. But to be able to slip into those states more often seems to me part of what this might free up. That's all I was really trying to say.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I do think possibly over time with practice, and it's always difficult to say, is this just getting older and becoming a little bit more mature in life, or is it through one's practice that I do feel more at ease with myself than I did when I was 20 or 30. Something has changed in the way I feel in the world. I feel I have less conflict. I feel I navigate life better than I used to, when I was always angry and confronting and getting nowhere.
Well, I'm delighted to hear it. It gives me hope, having spent a large part of my earlier years debating.
I still enjoy that. I enjoy debating. This has been a lovely conversation.
Oh, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you, Peter. It's really good to talk, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Indeed, me too. All right, Daniel. Nice to meet you.
See you.
Bye-bye.